Greater Essex County District School Board's 2023-24 Public Consultation Presentation. My name is Shelley Armstrong, Superintendent of Business, and I am joined by Sean Mayhew, Manager of Finance. The purpose of this presentation is to provide the community with details surrounding the school board's annual budget and engage stakeholders in the budget process. The agenda for today's presentation will consist of a brief overview of the Greater Essex County District School Board, a review of how public education is funded by the ministry, a look into funding specifically as it relates to the GECDSB, a glimpse of the board's financial position, the development process of the board's 2023-24 budget, including timelines, some items for consideration as part of the budget process, and areas where the public can be involved in the process. Let's begin with a quick overview of the Greater Essex County District School Board. School board trustees are the members of a school board. They are locally elected representatives of the public, and they are the community's advocate for public education. Trustees are required to carry out their responsibilities in a manner that assists the board in fulfilling its duties under the Education Act. The Greater Essex County District School Board's Board of Trustees includes 10 trustees. They are elected for a 4-year term through the municipal election process. The current Board of Trustees was elected in October 2022 and will serve until November 2026. The chairperson of the board is Gail Hadfield. Each trustee is a representative of a specific region or ward within the municipalities that are served by the GECDSB. The strategic priorities of the board are considered throughout the budget process and form the basis of the board's mission and the fulfillment of its vision of building tomorrow together. Alignment of resources to the district's goals is paramount in ensuring funding is spent, advancing the best interest of all stakeholders. Student success and well-being are at the core of the budget development. Some key data points about the Greater Essex County District School Board include: 1, there are 4 publicly funded school systems in Ontario: English Public, English Catholic, French Language Public, and French Language Catholic. In total, there are 72 public school boards in Ontario. The GECDSB is the 17th largest public school board in Ontario. The GECDSB has 10 elected trustees. There are also 2 student trustees who provide a student perspective on issues facing the board. Our board has 69 schools that are spread amongst 9 municipalities. 55 of these schools are elementary or kindergarten to grade 8 schools, and 14 are secondary or grade 9 through grade 12 schools. Our student enrollment is approximately 36,000 students. The board staff is approximately 4,000 full-time positions and has an annual operating budget of $490 million. In addition, the capital budget is approximately $72 million, and this provides for new school builds, additions, and improvements. The next slides will review how public education is funded. Public education funding is provided by the Ministry of Education. Education is the second largest sector of the provincial budget, with healthcare being the largest. The Education Act sets forth the formula for education funding and is referred to as the Grants for Student Needs, or GSN for short. The GSN is the primary source of funding for public school boards in Ontario, including the GECDSB. The GSN is intended to provide a fair allocation for all students wherever they live in Ontario, operate in a fair and non-discriminatory manner as between the public and the Catholic school boards in both the English language and French language systems, provide funding to maintain schools and to build new schools where they are needed, allow school boards some flexibility to decide how funds will be allocated to programs and supports and among schools, and lastly, to restrict how school boards spend money in some specific areas. For example, to protect funding for capital and special education and to limit spending on school board administration. In addition, the GSN promotes school board accountability by ensuring that school boards report consistently and publicly on how they spend their allocations. The Grants for Student Needs, or GSN, provides 95% of the Greater Essex County District School Board's funding. This funding flows directly from the Ministry of Education. The Ministry of Education also provides the board with supplemental funding to the GSN, known as Priorities and Partnership Funding, or PPF for short. PPF grants are reviewed and assessed by the Ministry of Education annually and represents approximately 1% of the board's total annual funding. Other funding sources, which represent 4% of the board's annual budget, include school fundraising revenues and donations, tuition fees from non-resident visa students studying abroad, and miscellaneous income, such as investment income, energy rebates, and other non-Ministry of Education government funding, such as federal funding under Jordan's Principle, which is a program to provide supports for Indigenous students. Overall, the GSN allocations totaled $26.1 billion in Ontario for the 2022-23 school year. The Grants for Student Needs comes from two sources. The first source is a portion of annual property tax known as the Education Property Tax Levy. Property taxes are collected by each municipality, and the education portion is remitted to school boards. In 2021-22, the GECDSB collected approximately $66 million from local municipalities. The second source is the school board operating grant that is provided by the province through the Ministry of Education. This portion tops up the amount received from municipalities to the amount determined by the funding formula. This slide illustrates how funding flows to school boards. Municipalities collect property taxes and send payments to local school boards. The funding formula is set by the Government of Ontario. The province then transfers, by way of income taxes and sales tax, the difference between a school board's entitlement and its revenue from property taxes. Therefore, school boards have revenues from provincial transfers and revenues from property taxes.
This section will review funding as it relates specifically to the Greater Essex County District School Board. As mentioned, the majority of GECDSB funding comes from the Ministry of Education from the Grants for Student Needs. The Priorities and Partnerships funding, or PPF, provides supplementary funding for specific ministry initiatives that are typically time-limited. All capital funding is also received from the Ministry of Education. As shown earlier, this represents 95% of the board total operating revenues. Other funding sources include educational development charges, or EDCs, which are used to fund the acquisition of school sites and related costs to accommodate growth-related pupil needs. In other words, EDCs help to fund the purchase of land. A fee is imposed when building permits are issued for residential developments in areas subject to growth under a bylaw. Other ministries provide funding for specific purposes, such as the Ontario Youth Apprenticeship Program or Adult Non-Credit English as a Second Language programs. Other funding areas include items such as student fees, school fundraising, interest income, and energy rebates. Of the total $26.1 billion provided by the grants for student needs, our board's portion is approximately $450 million. The GSN is made up of three components: the Pupil Foundation grants, the School Foundation grants, and 16 special purpose grants. The allocation for each component is shown in the pie chart. Just over half, or 51%, of the GSN comes from the two foundation grants, and the remaining funding are special purpose grants, which we will review in further detail. The Pupil and School Foundation grants cover the basic costs of an educational experience that is common to all students. The foundation grants cover the cost of classroom staffing, in-school administration such as principals and secretaries, textbooks and learning materials, supplies, computers, and other direct classroom expenses. This funding is allocated based on total student enrollment and the number of schools. The special purpose grants, 16 in total, fund the unique needs of students, schools, and school boards related to location, student, and school needs, and a board's demographic profile. We will review the special purpose grants in further detail in a couple slides. Overall, the GSN provides funding of approximately $11,500 for every full-time elementary student and $12,000 for every full-time secondary student. Also, there are over 100 non-resident students attending GEC DSB schools on study visas. These students pay tuition directly to the board and are not funded by the GSN. Enrollment is the primary driver of funding for the board. Therefore, it's important for the board to continuously monitor and analyze enrollment projections and trends. This slide shows total enrollment levels over the last 5 years and the expected enrollment in 2022-23. Enrollment was steadily increasing from 2015 to 2020. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, enrollment has decreased. This is primarily due to families deciding to homeschool their children. The board is currently reviewing projections for the 23-24 school year and is hopeful to see an increase in enrollment for the 23-24 school year. Just under half of the board's total GSN funding is provided through 16 special purpose grants. These supplemental grants recognize the circumstances beyond those that are captured in the two foundation grants. These grants recognize that different levels of support are required by school boards to provide quality education in different locations to respond to the needs of particular students and schools and support varying demographic profiles. These grants are specific to their purpose, and there is limited flexibility in spending. For example, the largest special purpose grant, called the Cost Adjustment and Teacher Qualification Grant, provides funding to the school board for teachers who, because of their qualifications and experience, have average salaries above the benchmark level used in the Pupil Foundation grant. The Special Education Grant provides funding to support students who require special education programs, services, and/or equipment, and it may only be used for its intended purpose. Other grants, such as the School Facility Operations and Renewal Grant, provides funding for maintenance and operations of our schools. For example, utilities, ground maintenance, custodial costs are funded by this grant. Student transportation is also funded as a special purpose grant and pays for all busing related costs. School boards may also raise funds. The GCDSB is a registered charity and may accept and receive donations as determined by board policy. Some examples of other funding include renting excess space, fees for enhanced programming or international student attendance, school fundraising, energy rebates, donations, and interest income. These funds should not be used to replace public funding for education or to support items funded through provincial grants. The GSN is fully detailed in what's referred to as the technical paper. The technical paper is issued in the spring of each year for the following school year and provides a detailed explanation of all the components and purposes of the GSN. There are components of the GSN that are enveloped or restricted. Envelope grants must be spent on their intended purpose. The purpose is defined in the technical paper, and all expenses under the enveloped grant must be reported to the ministry. Typically, any unspent enveloped GSN grants are permitted to be carried forward to future years. Examples of components of the GSN that are enveloped are special education, targeted student support funding, Indigenous education funding, experiential learning, and mental health supports. However, it is important to note that just because a grant is not enveloped, it does not mean that the board has complete flexibility in the use of that funding. For instance, the transportation grant pays directly for transportation of students to and from school. Another example is the debt service support grant, which pays for the interest expense on capital loans, a direct reimbursement from the ministry. The next slides will review the Greater Essex County District School Board's financial position. As at September 1st, 2022, the board has a total accumulated surplus of $45.6 million. Of that balance, $13.3 million represents surplus that has been set aside to offset depreciation expenses on previous capital expenses and pay for future capital, such as the Kingsville K-12 minor capital. Therefore, it is restricted to that purpose. $366,000, a relatively small portion, has been set aside at the school level for the purchase of supplies. $31.9 million represents the board's accumulated operating surplus. This represents approximately 7% of the board's annual operating allocation. $4.4 million of this balance is projected to be used in the current school year as a result of the increased cost of staff absenteeism and unfunded inflation. This will reduce the surplus to 6% of the annual allocation. Generally, the ministry considers a 4% or larger operating surplus to be in good standing. Over the past 10 years, the board has ensured its capital deficit was paid off and that a healthy surplus was maintained for unanticipated expenditures such as a global pandemic. Fiscal stewardship is vital to the board. Also, the Education Act restricts the use of the board's operating surplus. This will be discussed later in the presentation. This slide reviews how the board spends its funding. As GCDSB is a service organization, salaries and benefits represent approximately 80% of the board's annual operating budget, which supports over 4,000 staff. This is in line with other school boards. The remaining expenses represent amounts for supporting classroom supplies and services, maintaining and operating school facilities, transportation of students to from school, and other board support services. This slide presents the same expenses in a different way. 77.6% of all expenses directly support the classroom. This includes all classroom staff and school administration, as well as resources directly for the classroom and students. 20% of all expenses support pupil accommodation and transportation. 2.4% of all expenses support the administrative functions of the board. The next slides will review budget considerations for the upcoming 23-24 school year. As part of these considerations, it is important to review and understand the programs and services that align to the board's strategic priorities. Here are some highlights how the budget supports creating confident learners. The board invests over $71 million in special education services and employs approximately 900 staff in support positions. Positions to re-engage students continue to be supported. IT supports are available to address technological needs both in the classroom and during remote studies. Approximately $3.6 million has been invested in the Indigenous education program. The budget currently supports 6 full-time positions to assist students in graduation and primarily address barriers to graduation. STEPS and GAINS programs are opened as needed to address special education needs. Most recently, these classrooms were opened at Riverside Secondary School, Westview Freedom Academy, Dougal Public School, Suzuki, Essex Public School, Legacy Oak Trail, Queen Elizabeth, Southwood, and Westgate. In the area of engaging communities, the board has continued to improve the board's social media presence on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Edsby as examples. A new board website has been launched and continues to be refined in its communication to our students, staff, and families. Increased supports in the area of Indigenous programming and equity and inclusion provide the community with advocacy in these areas. An open response budget survey is made available to the public to opportunities for feedback. A budget consultation presentation is hosted and made available to the public to provide an overview of the current budget and planning process and considerations. The board continues to ensure the ethical stewardship of its resources by investment of $100,000 for renaming and branding schools, eliminating certain single-use plastic products, declaration of a climate emergency, maintaining a healthy accumulated surplus to address unexpected and urgent needs that may arise in a given year, improving the overall healthiness of the school environment through significant ventilation improvements. As the 23-24 year approaches, some challenges and uncertainties must be considered. Bargaining continues for collective agreements that expired on August 31st, 2022. Negotiations could have a significant impact to the budget. Projected enrollment increases or decreases will have an impact on funding levels. Absences and related costs continue to be an area of concern and consideration for the upcoming budget. Over the last 2 years, the pandemic has put additional pressure in this area, and it is unknown what the continued impact will be for the upcoming school year. Supply chain delays and inflation on supplies and services continue to pose a concern entering the 23-24 school year. As underlying commodity prices climb, a budgeted dollar has less value than in prior years. Current inflation is approximately 7 to 8%, which exceeds ministry funding.
Now we will discuss some items of public interest as the board moves forward through the 2023-24 budget development process. This slide shows the legislative requirements of the budget process. The board's fiscal year is September 1st to August 31st. The budget for 2023-24 must be submitted to the Ministry of Education by June 30th. The board is required to balance the budget, meaning that expenses must equal the funding provided. However, there is a provision that permits the board to use its accumulated surplus by up to 1% of its operating allocation, which for our particular board is $4.4 million. This is not a preferred method for budgeting, since it is not a sustainable practice. The board would only consider using this to address one-time pressures as a temporary measure only to adjust to in-year cost structures. This chart shows a timeline leading up to the 2023-24 budget submission on June 30th. On February 7th, at the public board meeting, budget timelines were announced and presented to the Board of Trustees. In February, the board will release a public budget survey to obtain feedback from all stakeholders and provide a public budget consultation presentation. In March or early April, it is expected that the ministry will release the technical paper and the various funding information. In April and May, updates will be provided at public board meetings, and there will be an opportunity for public consultation at those meetings. Budget approval is expected in mid-June, and the approved budget will be submitted to the Ministry of Education on or before June 30th. Public consultation is welcomed and encouraged. The Greater Essex County District School Board is committed to the continuous improvement of the budget process. Feedback is an integral part of the development of the board's annual budget. There are multiple ways to be part of the budget process. If you haven't already, the board encourages you to participate in the budget survey. A link is provided on the board's website. You can also email the board at budget@publicboard.ca with your comments or feedback. You may also contact your local trustee and have a discussion with them. Their contact information is available on the board's website. Also, there are 2 opportunities for community members to speak at public board meetings. There are meetings scheduled on April 4th and April 18th. If you want to speak as a delegate, instructions are provided on our website. Thank you for your time today. It is our hope that this presentation was informative to you.